Welcome to the History with Ali podcast, where we talk all things history, literature, and media studies. Today, I'm glad to be joined by Helene Harrison, who is a Tudor historian and author based in England. So, Helen, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Just thank you so much for having me.
I'm so excited to talk to you about The Many Faces of Anne Boleyn. Is this your newest book?
Yes, it came out last year, so that is currently my latest published, although my fourth book is due out in August.
Oh, that's really exciting. Do you have a title yet for that?
Yes, it's called Henry VIII's Quest for an Heir, The King's Great Matter. So it's available for pre-order now, basically anywhere you get your books. American release date will be a couple of months later, usually around October time, I think.
So, could you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm from the northeast of England, so I live on the coast. It's quite cold, although today it's a lovely sunny day. I have 3 degrees, so I have two in history in undergrad and a master's, and I also have a master's in library management as well. And I work full time at my alma mater in the university library alongside my research and writing. So busy, busy, but I enjoy it, so that's the main thing.
That's cool. So, I'm an adjunct professor at a university, so I love being in the academic world. So,
Yeah.
this is a nonfiction book, of course, so it must have taken you a lot of research. So, how did you get into history and then the Tudors and Anne Boleyn?
Well, I've always sort of grown up around history. My dad's always been very into his military and naval history. So I sort of grew up surrounded by stacks of history books. So that was always interesting. And, growing up, we'd be camping. We didn't really have trips abroad. We'd, spend a lot of time in a tent in the rain, visiting castles and historic ruins. So again, I grew up around it really. And then I did my GCSE, which was 20th century history. So my initial interest was in Nazi Germany, specifically the Holocaust, because I do have a family connection there, family in Austria. So that was sort of my initial interest. And then when I did my A levels, which is age 16 to 18, I did modules on Tudor rebellions and Elizabeth I. So that was sort of my segue into the Tudors, really. And then starting at university, I chose to do a lot of women's history modules. I hadn't really done a lot of women's history before. So we did, witchcraft, women, crime and subversion, women in power. And that sort of led me to Anne Boleyn. And just as I was starting university, I picked up a copy of Alison Weir's book, The Lady in the Tower, The Fall of Anne Boleyn. So that was the first book I ever read on Anne Boleyn. And yeah, I wrote my dissertation on Anne Boleyn's public image. And then I wrote my master's dissertation on Anne Boleyn in literature, film, and on stage. So this book really just brings together both of my dissertations and expands it out. So the first of those dissertations I finished in 2012. And then 15 years later, The Many Faces of Anne Boleyn was published. So it's been, yeah, a bit of a ride.
Wow, that's so cool. And also, you must have learned so much over that length of time to be studying one subject. And
Yeah.
then I can definitely tell because we kind of have met in the Instagram world. What took you to the passion for it, aside from Anne, just the tutors in general?
Yeah, I started writing my blog when I was finishing my undergraduate degree because I sort of felt a bit bereft, even though I was going on to do a master's degree. Obviously, as you progress through education, you specialize down more. And I just wanted to be able to explore more of the Tudors because at that point I hadn't really done, much other than sort of the general stuff and then a bit of a deep dive into Anne Boleyn. And I was interested in, some of the six wives, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I. So I saw that as sort of my route into the Tudors, really more generally. And then I just sort of started falling down rabbit holes, which I think is an occupational hazard when you start diving into the Tudors, or probably any era of history, to be honest. And then sort of my interest has gone out sideways as well. I don't think you can really study the Tudors without knowing at least the background to the Wars of the Roses. So I went a bit earlier. And then since then as well, I've developed a bit of a passion for true crime. So I've been doing some research into Jack the Ripper as well. It's just, you start with one thing and it just ends up going in unexpected directions, I suppose.
That's so true. And that's what it's been like for me. I started with Philippa Gregory books, actually, and then it has taken me down this path of loving the Tudors. So, for our listeners who don't know that much about Anne Boleyn, her image is kind of contested because there aren't many images of her from her lifetime. Are there any images from her lifetime that we've seen?
There's not specifically what we would say is a portrait of Anne Boleyn from her lifetime. As far as we're aware, I think it's important to say that because they haven't all been tested. And they can't all be tested. The Nid Hall, for instance, we can't date it. So it's possible there's a contemporary one hanging about that hasn't been tested. But the image that people will think of from Anne's lifetime is a little bronze medal that's in the British Museum. It's dated 1534, so that date is on the medal, so we know that that is the date. Obviously, with the medal, it's not in colour. So, for instance, we don't have things like hair colour. We don't know the colour of the dress she's wearing or the hood. But she is wearing a gable hood, an English gable hood, which I think is important to say because people say about some portraits you see on social media, it can't be Anne Boleyn because she's not wearing a French hood. We do have evidence that she wore both. We know she wore the gable hood for this medal. We know she wore the gable hood to go to her execution. So I think she very consciously linked it with queenship. She wore it for these big moments. There are a couple of other sort of images of Anne Boleyn from her lifetime. There's a very crude sketch from a coronation banquet, effectively seating plan, but that's more just to say this is where she will be. We can't pick out any features or anything like that from that. And the current Capturing a Queen exhibition at Hever Castle, the research of Owen Emerson and Jessica Carey Bunning, there is now a new to us as far as we know, image from a pamphlet which was created to celebrate Anne's coronation, printed by Wynkin de Worde, which is just a brilliant name for a printer. I'm just throwing that out there. But it sort of shows 3 stages of Henry and Anne's relationship. So we have these images of Henry and Anne courting, we think getting married, and then the coronation as well. So there's images, but it's difficult to pick out any real detail from any of them. And the medal as well is now damaged. That probably happened sometime in the 19th century because there is a sketch from that time showing it without any damage. So the medal was probably damaged in the late 19th century sometime. But again, there is limited information we can take from that, really.
Did Henry VIII really order for the images of Anne to be destroyed, or is that just kind of an urban legend?
As far as we know at the minute, it's an urban legend. People like to say, well, nothing survived, so it must have been purposefully destroyed. I always say there's nearly 500 years since she died. Anything could have vanished, been destroyed, accidentally or on purpose in any of that time. Just because it doesn't survive today doesn't mean it was destroyed. We don't have any primary sources saying that Henry VIII ordered Anne Boleyn's portraiture to be destroyed. There is one, I think it's a Privy Purse account that says Henry VIII had ordered the emblems of Anne Boleyn and Wolsey to be removed from palaces and replaced. But I will say that did happen after Catherine of Aragon's fall, to be replaced with Anne Boleyn's, after Catherine Howard to be replaced with Catherine Parr. It's not uncommon. It didn't just happen to Anne Boleyn. So I don't think we can really stake anything on that. I will also say there are a lot of things with Anne's emblems and her initials that have survived. We have this prototype medal that survived. We have the Boleyn Cup, which is at Cirencester, that has Anne's falcon on it. There are bed valances that survived with the HA initials on. There's plenty of things that do survive. So I don't think we can say a wholesale destruction happened. In the 1547 inventories, there's plenty of evidence of falcons, of A, B. So there's certainly no evidence to say a wholesale destruction was ordered at any point. And the things that we don't have, it's possible they were just lost or have vanished into private collections over the years. We know there was an image, a full-length portrait of Anne Boleyn said to be in the collection of Lord Lumley in the 1770s. We don't know where that is. We don't know if it's been cut down, if it's been lost in a fire, if it is in a private collection. So there's still a lot of questions, I think, but there's definitely no evidence of a wholesale destruction unless something comes to light to suggest that Henry did order it.
Since she was queen, is it fair to assume that portraits would have been painted of her?
I think it's very likely. Jane Seymour's queenship was a lot shorter, and we do have that incredible Holbein panel of Jane Seymour. I think given that the medal was created, I think possibly to celebrate a pregnancy in 1534, although again, we don't know that, but the date would line up with Anne's second pregnancy. I think, given medals were being created, an image probably would. We have a couple of debated Holbein sketches of Anne Boleyn, which would have been preparatory for probably for a panel portrait or a miniature. Obviously, the sitters' identities of both of those are highly debated. Personally, I think the Windsor sketch is Anne. That's the one with she's wearing sort of what looks almost like a chemise and a cap, for those who aren't familiar. There's been a lot of debate over that. People say it's not pretty enough to be Anne, but I can see a lot of resemblance to the medal, which I think is important. And the other argument people use for that is that the inscription saying it's Anne dates to a couple of hundred years later. I will point out that inscription was taken from John Cheke's identification from the Great Book of Holbein Sketches. Cheke did know Anne, at very least by sight, but he had some financial assistance from her. I don't think it's likely he would have misidentified his patroness. But there are, again, we can't say that for certain. There are questions over that. But people do cite the fact that inscription on it is later. It is taken from an earlier inscription from someone who knew. And I think that is important. And I do wonder if that Holbein sketch either was meant for a full panel portrait or for a more personal miniature. We have Henry Fitzroy, Henry VIII's illegitimate son, sort of in a similar almost state of undress in a miniature. I think it's possible there could have been an intention to paint Anne Boleyn in a similar way for that. But again, we don't know. As far as we know, we don't have a miniature of Anne surviving, although there are questions again over that. But I think she would have been painted for a portrait and probably a Holbein, which either is still around and unrecognisable or has at some point been lost or vanished into a private collection. Because we do have missing portraits of Anne that were around and have since vanished. So yeah, I think that's entirely possible, but I do think Anne was painted and likely by Holbein.
I agree because he painted lesser important people at the court.
Yeah.
So why would he not paint the queen? So what was her reputation like during her lifetime? And do you think that the fact that she was so controversial kind of clouds the primary sources? I know that, for instance, Chapuis wasn't a big fan and he referred to her as the concubine. So I don't think that he's an unbiased source. What do you think?
I think it's difficult to know what the general populace thought of Anne, because to be honest, a lot of them would not have been familiar with her, would not have been familiar probably with Catherine of Aragon, except as, the queen who'd always been there. So I think for the general population's point of view, it's difficult to know because we don't have those sources. Chapuis is an interesting one. People say you can't trust anything he says because he was so biased, but Chapuis is quite an incredible sort of chronicler of the times. Although he is biased, we know he didn't like Anne. He was a great supporter of Catherine of Aragon and Princess Mary. But the important thing to say with Chapuis is that his master Charles V would have expected him to report back faithfully what was being said and what was going on. So although he may put some bias on it, I think a lot of the events that he recounts probably did happen or something very, very similar happened Charles V would have been pretty angry if Chapuis was feeding him inaccurate information from the English court. Chapuis, although he was a partisan of Catherine and Mary, that's not why he was there. He was there to report back to Charles V faithfully and as accurately as he could. And I think that's often overlooked with Chapuis. So I think that's an important. Again, it's interesting because Anne is so often connected with the French because of, she spent so long at the French court, but actually the ambassadorial reports, there's not all that much in them about. So that's quite interesting that we get so much from Chapuis and there's not all that much from the French. We get odd mentions in Venetian and sort of papal reports as well. But things about her reputation, Chapuis calls her the concubine, probably not as many times as the English translations would have us believe. Lauren McKay has done some brilliant work on that, on Chapuis in general, but also on, how he portrayed the six queens. Her reputation's difficult to pull apart because she's so intimately connected with the English Reformation, which of course divided the entire country for decades. So even later chroniclers, we have Nicholas Sander with the six fingers, the wen, the three nipples covered in moles, but he's trying to portray Anne as a heretic. So he has a very particular purpose. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we have John Knox, who wants to portray her as a Protestant martyr. So you always have to read the bias into it, but it doesn't make the sources completely unreliable because it is still important to understand how people are being seen and why that is being used in that way. So it's difficult to unravel Anne's reputation because she was so divisive and people did have particular reasons for wanting to use her both in her lifetime and afterwards.
Do you feel like the French kind of abandoned Anne? Because I think maybe she expected more support for them, and especially maybe during her downfall, she may have expected support for them, but it definitely didn't come. So what do you think
Yeah.
about her in France, I suppose?
It's interesting because it's difficult to know what happened during her teenage years in France. We don't really have any evidence of who she was close to. We know she was exposed to reformist ideas, both at the court of Margaret of Austria and then at Francis I and Queen Claude's court. But yeah, I think Anne did expect more French support. I think particularly because the Calais meeting in 1532 seemed to go so well and they married so soon afterwards, which suggests, there was French support there. But I think the key thing was that Francis I, because he's a king, he's not just, Henry and Anne's friend. He's thinking of the wider political and diplomatic things that are going on. Charles V and the Holy Roman Empire are this big power, and with Charles V being Catherine of Aragon's nephew, there's going to be diplomatic issues there. So I think if Francis did want to give them more support, he was opening himself up politically to problems. But he may not have actually wanted to support Henry and Anne. We don't know. We don't have the sources to tell us what the French really thought. So it is difficult to be sure. But, Heather Darcy's recently written a book about the downfall of Anne Boleyn, and she discusses the French question in there. Estelle Peronca's done some brilliant work. I drew on Estelle's work quite a lot when I was writing the chapter on Anne through foreign eyes, trying to get at the French angle, which is difficult to get to, more so than the imperial angle. With Chapuis's many, many letters, there's a lot more evidence there. So the French angle is interesting. I think both Anne and Henry did expect more support from France, and I think Anne potentially was hoping the French would step in during her downfall. Catherine had the support of the imperialists. I think Anne was hoping the French would step in for her, but she had no family ties. She didn't have those powerful familial connections that Catherine of Aragon did.
What do you think her role in Elizabeth's life was like when Elizabeth was alive and she was alive too? Was she portrayed as a good mother, or how did people kind of portray her role of motherhood? And also, it's kind of harsh that they executed a mother. I mean, kind of is an
Yeah,
understatement, but she did have a daughter, so they did kill a mother.
yes. It's it's again, it's difficult to get at. We don't really have a lot of accounts. I mean, one of the last things from the sources it seems that Anne did before her arrest was to buy clothes for Elizabeth. We don't think after the end of April, possibly as late as the 1st of May, Anne wouldn't have seen Elizabeth after that. But it seems likely she may have been at court in the April. So, it's I think it's a reflection on Anne and her view of motherhood, that when she was feeling all of this fear, because she sensed something was going on. We know that she spoke to Matthew Parker and asked him to look after Elizabeth. So it seems her last thoughts were for her daughter and for her family, because we know when she was in the tower, she talked about her mother. She worried her mother might pass away from the grief of it all. So Anne was generally, I think, quite family oriented, and it seems she was as good a mother to Elizabeth as she could be, given her role of queen. She wasn't expected to breastfeed, for instance. She wasn't expected to have her daughter around her all the time. So as far as we can tell, Anne seemed to be a good mother and to want to be a good mother. We know Elizabeth, as she grew up, the family of Henry VIII portrait from 1545, we see Elizabeth wearing the A pendant necklace. We don't know how she came to that, whether her father gave her it or whether someone else passed it down. And the checkers ring is another big one. There's debate over the identity of the other woman in the ring, but I do believe it's Anne, and I believe Elizabeth either was gifted that ring or commissioned it for herself. If it was a gift, I think it would have been gifted by someone who was close to her and who knew the reverence in which she held her mother and the respect that she had for her mother, which I do believe she did have. And again, I think Tracy Borman did some brilliant work on Elizabeth in the last few years and her relationship with her. It is devastating to think that a child not yet 3 years old, lost her mother in such a brutal way. And we don't know when Elizabeth found out the circumstances of Anne's execution, what she thought about it. We have literally no records of that. I like to think it was someone close to Elizabeth and who knew Anne, possibly Kat Ashley, Blanche Parry, who may have told Elizabeth. And I like to think that perhaps Catherine Carey, Anne's niece, would have perhaps spoken to Elizabeth if again she knew Anne, which we don't know. Or Henry Carey, again, who was a ward of Anne's. They were Mary Boleyn's children. I like to think that perhaps one of them spoke to Elizabeth about her mother when she became queen. But again, no evidence, I'm afraid. Difficult to be sure.
For a lot of this, there's like no evidence.
Yeah.
So it's
I
frustrating,
think
but
that's history in general. I think it's just you have these tiny little slivers that you have to try and piece something together from, or just make it clear that it is supposition. We don't actually have any evidence for this, but this might have happened.
yeah. Do you think that there was anything Anne could have done to be proven innocent? Because I think it was probably pre-decided by Henry, but because the allegations, because we're focusing on the portrayals, since the allegations were so far-fetched, did people actually think that Anne was innocent?
It's interesting because we have a comment from Chapuis, either on the day of her execution or soon after, I think, that he says it sounds ill in the ears of the people. So even, so soon after she's dead, people are going, this doesn't feel right. The day after Anne's execution, Henry gets betrothed to another woman. There's already rumours in London about Henry and Jane Seymour. We know there's a pamphlet distributed that Henry writes to Jane to tell her to ignore. So we know people are aware that Henry has got another queen lined up. Chapuis, even though he hates Anne, he doesn't seem to believe the charges against her, and he reports that the people don't believe it either. I don't think there's any way that Anne could have escaped it once she was arrested. I think at that point Henry VIII had made his mind up. And I don't think the peers who were on the jury were brave enough or stupid enough, depending how you look at it, to vote her innocent. Even Anne's father, Thomas Boleyn, he didn't sit on the trials of his son and his daughter, but he did for the other men. So through them, he effectively condemned his daughter at least. Because if the men were guilty, Anne couldn't be innocent. I do think Anne hoped that she would live. I do think that she believed Henry might send her to a nunnery or send her abroad, possibly to France. But I think once her brother died, she knew there was no hope for her at that point, because Henry wouldn't kill her brother and the other men and let her live. So I think that was must have been just a devastating moment for Anne. Not only had her brother died, but she's now definitely having to face her own mortality as well. And of course, we know that Henry ordered the French swordsman before the trial, which says a lot about Henry's confidence in the verdict that was going to be given against her. Natalie Grueninger's book, The Final Year of Anne Boleyn, she has appendices at the back where she goes through all of the charges, the dates and the places that these adulteries are said to have taken place, and we can disprove most of them. Either Anne or the person involved weren't in the place that was claimed, or Anne was recovering from childbirth in one case after Elizabeth. So yeah, but even if Anne had been able to give all that evidence, I don't think it would have done anything to help her. I think once Henry VIII made his mind up, that was it.
What do you think about the most far out allegations, which to me are the witchcraft and incest? Was she really viewed as a witch, or did anyone believe this incest story?
Anne was never accused of witchcraft. As far as we can tell, that's a 20th century invention. It's often attributed to Nicholas Sander in the reign of Elizabeth I, but having read his work in full, and thanks to the work of Sylvia Barbara Soberton, he never accused Anne of witchcraft. There's one contemporary comment which suggests Henry said that Anne had bewitched him, but that's the only contemporary report of witchcraft. And actually, the Witchcraft Act wasn't introduced into England until 1543, so it wasn't actually punishable by death offence at that point when Anne was executed. So she was never accused of witchcraft. As far as I can tell, it's a 20th century fictional invention. Can't track exactly when the first mention was, but I can't find any trace of it in Tudor, Stuart, or Victorian sources. So it seems to have come in with the advent of historical fiction and film, sadly, much as it makes a good story. The incest accusation, I mean, when George Boleyn was tried, Anne had already been condemned. People were betting that George was going to be let off. They said he defended himself well, but, we don't have any specific comments on whether they believed the incest charge. It's more general comments to suggest that the people didn't believe in the guilt. So we don't really have anything specific related to the incest. It's often said that accusation came from Jane Boleyn, George Boleyn's wife. We have no evidence of that. I think it just says a woman. The source, I can't remember the exact wording, but there are no names as to who made that accusation. So I think Jane Boleyn's quite possibly been unfairly maligned there. Lady Worcester's another person mentioned as giving evidence. Again, we don't really have much to substantiate. There's just not much to say where this accusation came from. I think it's likely Cromwell just wanted to bring down George Boleyn. He wanted to be able to bring down those who were close to Anne, who might speak for Anne, and people who had power. It's people who were in the Privy Chamber who had access to the king. And I think it would have been far too risky for Cromwell to bring Anne down and leave George alive.
And Henry also killed, some of his friends during this. So were people just completely expendable to him?
I think in a way they were, but I think we also have to take in Thomas Cromwell's role, because Cromwell was bringing down, for instance, William Brereton. We know Cromwell and Brereton had a bit of a difficult relationship. So I don't think we can completely discount Cromwell's involvement in choosing who these men were, but they were people who were known to be close to Anne Boleyn or who had had intimate conversations with her. We know Henry Norris, she had the dead men's shoes conversation, which I'm sure is what dragged him in. She'd had a conversation with Mark Smeaton, who was a musician, and that conversation may have gone a bit further than it should have done. And that gave Cromwell the opportunity to pull Smeaton in as someone of lower birth. We don't know that Smeaton was tortured. He may have been. He was certainly questioned at Cromwell's house, and we don't know what happened there. But whatever happened, Smeaton confessed. And his lower birth, I think, gave Cromwell some leeway to make threats and do things that he couldn't do to the other men. So I think that was an in to get a confession from one of them. But of course, there were two men arrested who were released. So we have Thomas Wyatt and Richard Page were both arrested and released. I think Wyatt's an interesting choice because he's probably the one that we actually have some form of evidence that he was once involved with Anne. Largely poetry, but we do believe it was about, at least some of them were about Anne. So I think him being released is interesting because that, you know, it was sort of known that there was a connection there, and to release him of all of them, I think Cromwell and Henry were trying to give some veracity to the other charges by making sure some were released. So it's interesting to try and unravel what happened and the speed that it all happened in less than 3 weeks.
So before we move into more modern portrayals, are there any myths about Anne Boleyn during her lifetime that you would like to myth bust for our listeners?
Well, the ones that come up most often are witchcraft, which I think I have already said, you know, definitely didn't happen. But, you know, there's questions over why her marriage was annulled. Again, we don't have an answer. The document that would have annulled the marriage doesn't survive. So it was probably either her former betrothal, or possible betrothal, I should say, to Henry Percy, the future Earl of Northumberland, or Henry VIII's relationship with Anne's sister Mary. There's also questions over the paternity of Mary's children, which again, we don't know. But I do discuss in my upcoming book if people are interested in that. There just seems to be, there's a lot of myths built up around Anne over the years. And what I tried to do in the book was go back to the sources and say, well, what do we actually know? And where have these myths actually come from? Some of them it is difficult to track down. But I think even today people see Anne Boleyn as a very romantic figure. You know, this great love affair. But, you know, the love letters, they're called the love letters. We have the 17 surviving letters from Henry VIII. And although there is some sense of romance in them, they're also quite scary in a way. I think there's a lot of pressure, it feels, from Henry to Anne. And obviously we don't know how Anne reacted to this. We don't have her letters in her words. But, you know, it's said that Anne held off deliberately for a crown. I don't believe she did. I think that's a myth that's been built up about ambitious women and powerful women. I don't think Anne particularly wanted it. We know Anne's father certainly wasn't happy about it as late as 1532. There's that was written that, you know, Thomas Boleyn and the Duke of Norfolk weren't happy about the marriage. I think Anne retreated to Hever or to other of the Boleyn residences because we don't know for sure it was Hever. I think she retreated in hopes that the king's ardour would cool, and it didn't. And it was only, I think, when she realised she couldn't get away from him that, you know, she acquiesced to marry him. And I don't know when Henry's attention turned from mistress to queen, but I think it was, you know, possibly quite early because he already knew Catherine couldn't give him a son at that point. But he knew he was capable of having a son because, of course, he had Henry Fitzroy and possibly Henry Carey, but there's questions over that. So I think that's an important one that I don't think Anne was angling for queenship from the start. I don't think she had any interest in the king, to be honest. And that's something I have gone backwards and forwards over the years. So if people read earlier things on my blog from 2012 and 2013, they might find a different opinion, but I think that's natural with history. As you delve more into it, opinions do change, and we need to be open to letting those change and develop as well. So yeah.
For me, the biggest myth that I would like to bust about Anne was that she was infertile. It drives me crazy that people say that because, having a miscarriage is a natural thing that happens to many, many women, and she was still young. Had he, had a little bit more patience, I do believe they could have had a son because she was still, what's the age that we think she was, like
Well, I
36 or
think she was
something?
born in 1501, so 35 maybe when she died, which, is the same age as me.
Me too.
So, she wasn't old by any means, perhaps old by the standards of the time to be childbearing. But we know she did have at least 3 pregnancies, possibly 4, depending on whether you believe the 1535 miscarriage. But, I think the January 1536 miscarriage is tragic because I wonder if part of the reason for that miscarriage was the stress she was under, ironically, to produce the son. And then Henry's accident, although, there's questions over how serious that was, it still would have been a shock. Even if he'd just been knocked from his horse and got straight back up, it would still have been a shock. And I wonder if that stress of needing to have a son is slightly ironically what contributed to the loss of that son. And we do know that that was a boy. So yeah, it's tragic. Yeah, I don't believe she was old. And yes, like you said, I think if Henry had perhaps given her a bit more time, because she had only been queen for three years, and 3 pregnancies in 3 years is still quite a lot to be going on with. So yeah, and of course there's the question over whether there was a medical issue with Rhesa's positive negative, which people can go and look into if they're interested. But yeah, that could have been causing issues if that happened, or if there was some other medical issue. There's been questions over Henry VIII's virility. So there's all manner of things at play that could explain why Catherine of Aragon had so many miscarriages, and then Anne had at least 2. And Jane Seymour, as far as we know, took, time to conceive. That wasn't immediate. So yeah, there's a whole host of things at play there.
Definitely. So, what do you think makes a good portrayal in a movie or a TV? And then I'll ask you probably specifically what you like, but what are you looking for in a portrayal?
I think a lot of the problems with the portrayals we've had, I'm thinking largely of the Tudors here, I have to be honest, is the sexualization of Anne. I think that is hugely influential if you look at social media. So I'd like to see something less sexualized, which I think we do get with the likes of Genevieve Bujold in Anne of the Thousand Days. Again, we do get it with Claire Foy in Wolf Hall as well. The other one I have to say I have a problem with is Natalie Portman in The Other Boleyn Girl. I generally have a problem with The Other Boleyn Girl. Partly historical accuracy and partly it doesn't come across as the Anne Boleyn we see in the sources. I think that is generally a fundamental problem, is that although, the Tudors, for instance, there are a lot of direct contemporary quotes used. We have quotes from the love letters, from Chapuis's letters, but they're often out of context of what's going on at the time. So they obviously have read the sources, but it's drama. It's to bring viewers in. It's not meant to be historically accurate. And, I love the Tudors, I have to admit. I absolutely love that TV show. But you can't read it as historical fact. And I think that's a problem that a lot of people have, is that they say it must be true. I saw it on the Tudors, or I saw it on The Other Boleyn Girl. No. Please go back and read the primary sources, because they're often actually a lot more interesting. And you'll get so much from them. But what I'd like to see more of in sort of screen portrayals is Anne's involvement in education, in charitable causes, her deep piety, and her changing religious views as she confronts more of these new books. We know she access to William Tyndale, Simon Fish. I'd just like to see something a bit more nuanced because I don't feel we get it. I think we get it more with Wolf Hall, Claire Foy's interpretation of Anne Boleyn. But again, that's not, it's still a biased interpretation because we're getting Anne through Cromwell's eyes. So it's told from a particular point of view with a particular purpose, which again, I think perhaps why we get more of Anne as a political animal, because that's how Cromwell is seeing her and that's what's threatening Cromwell. So I think, we get all of these different interpretations, but there's not one interpretation that brings everything together. And that's what I really, really want to see.
In Heather Darcy's book that you referenced, The Judicial Murder of Anne Boleyn, she talks a lot about Anne in banned books.
Mm.
And maybe that being more of a reason for her downfall than we usually consider, and that would be really cool to see. But what is your favorite on-screen adaptation of Anne?
I have a real soft spot for Genevieve Bujold in Anne of the Thousand Days. Just, she really brings to the fore Anne's temper, which we know she had. She made these careless comments when she was scared. We see in Genevieve's portrayal, we get the Percy relationship. We get bits of that sort of in the other Boleyn Girl, but we really get it there. And of course, the scenes in the tower at the end. We know Henry didn't visit her in the tower. That is completely a dramatized scene, but it is so memorable. And we see the temper come out, but we also see her absolute certainty in her own innocence, which we know she swore on the sacrament she was innocent, which, we don't really see in Anne of the Thousand Days. We get it in the Tudors, but we don't in Anne of the Thousand Days. Again, I wish they'd bring some of these interpretations together. But yeah, I just think she brought Anne's personality to life. And sometimes I think that's the key to a good Anne Boleyn portrayal. But I think possibly the real Anne lies somewhere between Genevieve Bujold and Claire Foy. I think bring those two together and we're getting somewhere a bit closer. Yeah. But as I say, I have a real soft spot for the Tudors as well. It's a guilty pleasure. And I think because you get all 6 queens as well, that's sort of, and it's, 4 series, you've got a lot of watching there. So I find that a real guilty pleasure, but I will avoid the other Boleyn Girl if at all possible, to be honest.
Yeah, I agree. The Anne of a Thousand Days is also my favorite portrayal. And of
Yeah.
course, I do love when Henry visits her because she gets to say the things that I wish she did get to say to him.
I think that's what it is. I think it's like the film wanted to give people, what they want. They wanted to see Anne confront Henry, and in that film we get it. Although we know, he didn't see her after the 1st of May in reality.
Are there any historical fiction novels that you've enjoyed the portrayal of Anne?
Oh God, I think there's 4 or 5 in the book, and that was difficult trying to narrow them down because there are so many of them. One of my favorites is actually based in the present day, so I'm going a bit left field here. It's also a ghost, but it's a series by Jennifer C. Wilson, who's a writer who's local to me. And she writes the Kindred Spirits series. So it's a series based in different historical places with ghosts. So the first one's the Tower of London. So you get the ghosts of Anne Boleyn, Richard III, Jane Grey, Catherine Howard. All of these Tudor figures come together, and the Anne you get in that book is so brilliantly witty, which we know she was in reality. We have sources to tell us that, but it's just, and the interplay with Richard III, you don't get those two together in a book. The interplay is brilliant. So that's one of my favorites. But I always enjoy a good Jean Plaidy novel. I struggled a bit with Alison Weir's, her Six Tudor Queens series. The portrayal of Anne Boleyn I struggled a little with, but the execution scene at the end of that book I thought was brilliantly done. So there's bits of a lot of novels that I like. Anne Boleyn's only a tiny part in Clemmy Bennett's novel, The Apple and the Tree, but I loved seeing Anne Boleyn in that. There's lots of different portrayals, and I often quite like the sort of left field ones. I have to be honest, the alternate histories, because there's another one by Laura Anderson, which posits that the premise of the story is that Anne didn't miscarry in January 1536. She birthed a healthy son who becomes king when Henry VIII dies. And George Boleyn is regent. Anne is the mother of the king and of Elizabeth. So we get to see the Anne Elizabeth relationship there, which is another one that I really love. So yeah, I like a lot of the left field ones, a lot of the what ifs, what might have happened.
Are there any nonfiction books you would recommend to our listeners about Anne that you think are credible?
The place to start for me is always Eric Ives, The Life and Death of Anne Boleyn. That's the real Anne Boleyn Bible. Some of his research is, sometimes now considered out of date, but I think it's a good starting point. He discusses so much, he does the chronology and then he has chapters on, religion and different aspects of Anne's life, which I think is always good. More recently, Tracy Borman's work on Anne and Elizabeth is brilliant. Anything by Owen Emerson and Kate McCaffrey, they've got a couple of exhibition books now. The latest Capturing a Queen one is brilliant. I finished that recently. Look, what else would I recommend? Oh, Elizabeth Norton's collection of documents. I believe it's now published as the Anne Boleyn Papers, although it was originally published under a different title. That is a brilliant collection if you just want to look at the contemporary sources. It really gives you a good overview. And John Guy and Julia Fox's Hunting the Falcon is also a brilliant read. But again, there's books by Caroline Angus, Heather Darcy, Amy Licence. There's so many brilliant books and people bringing out new research, looking at old sources in new ways. So I think it's always worth reading widely. Even if you don't agree with someone's arguments, it's always worth knowing what they're arguing and why. So yeah, just read as widely as you can, really. But Eric Ives is always a good place to start.
Speaking of new research and exciting developments, I was driving in my car like 2 months ago listening to NPR. Obviously, I'm in the US and I may have heard your name dropped. So, could you tell our listeners about this super exciting discoveries that you've made that are related to this book as well? But since the book has come out, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So my book came out July 2025. The news broke in The Guardian back in February this year, and so 2026. And yeah, I mean, I'd known for about a month beforehand, I think maybe before the news broke, but couldn't say anything at that point because Hiva had it under an embargo. But I'd known the Hiva Rose portrait of Anne was undergoing some testing, dendrochronology, they were hoping to date it, and some scientific analysis of the paint, and they were doing some scans, which, was all really exciting to be able to find out more about this portrait anyway. And then I got a message from Owen Emerson, who's obviously one of the curators at Hiva, to say that they'd had the results of the analysis back. So he told me the date of the portrait, which is circa 1583, which is an interesting year in Elizabethan history anyway. And then he said that the scans they'd had done had revealed there was a change made to the underdrawing of the portrait. So anyone who's familiar with the portrait, it was originally supposed to be more in the style of the National Portrait MPG 668 portrait. So it wasn't supposed to include any hands. You can actually see on the underdrawing that there was originally just a triangle to show sort of the underarm, and then hands were drawn in over the top of that triangle. So at some point, we don't know how soon after the original underdrawing was done, but a change was made before the paint was put on to add the hands and the rose that she's holding, hence the name of the portrait is the Hiva Rose. So that was all interesting in its own right. But in my book, which I published last year, I'd written on page 5, so it's even really early in the book, that I wondered if the hands in the Hiva Rose portrait were deliberately added to refute Nicholas Sanders' claim that Anne Boleyn had 6 fingers, because I often will print things out and look at them side by side. I find I get more out of it than on a screen. So I had all of these portraits of Anne printed out when I was writing my portraiture chapter. And the Hever Rose stood out to me because it is the only one with hands. And it just, the hands, they're all defined. Each finger is sort of individually picked out, which isn't entirely unusual in portraits with hands, but you don't often see every finger individually splayed. They're often sort of bunched together. The flower inclusion wasn't particularly unusual. We see it in portraits of Elizabeth of York, Henry VII, Henry VIII, Prince Arthur. So, there's additional elements there. But I thought the splaying of the fingers was deliberate. So it's about 2 lines I wrote in the book. And Owen had just messaged me and said, your theory has scientific evidence to back it up. Obviously, it's far from proven. We don't know the intent of the artist in 1583, if that is what he was doing, but the timing is important because the panel dated to 1583. Nicholas Sanders' work, Rise and Fall of the Anglican Schism, was first printed in 1585, but it would have been circulating in manuscript form in the early 1580s. So it's quite possible that someone commissioned this, whether it was Elizabeth herself or a courtier, to deliberately, physically sort of rebut Sanders' claims. So it's incredibly exciting when the news broke. It's been a bit of a whirlwind, to be honest. But I've had so much support, and Owen Emerson, Kate McCaffrey have been brilliant, and of course the team at Hever doing all of this analysis. They've done some brilliant work, and hopefully they've sort of set the standard for testing other portraits of Anne, that maybe we can get some other dates, because currently the Hever Rose dates to 1 year earlier than the National Portrait Gallery one. It's the earliest dated portrait of Anne that we have. So it'd be interesting to see, for instance, where the other B pattern portraits might fall. The Lyndhurst, the 2 Ripon portraits, where they fall within the iconography, really. So hopefully it's opened up, different paths. And I know not everyone agrees with my theory, but I think the combination of the timing, the dating, the change to the underdrawing, it all fits. And 1583 as well, there were 2 rebellions against Elizabeth I in that year. She was very focused on lineage, her right to the throne, and I think rebutting these rumours against her mother was a way of her shoring up her own dynastic lineage, as possibly was the inclusion of the flower to link it back to Elizabeth of York, Henry VII, Henry VIII. So I think the change served multiple functions. So yeah, it's interesting. And if people want to read more, I've written a couple of posts on my blog and Substack, so people can go check those out.
Yeah, I mean, congratulations. It's so exciting. And I think it shows beautifully how collaborative history is, which I think is so cool in this specific moment, because you had done the research, then Hever, with more access, was able to do the painting research and everything, and they still credited you. And that makes me really happy, because sometimes that gets lost in the process a little bit.
Yeah, and I think particularly with media as well, newspapers, they write headlines to grab readers. They're not intent on academic credit. So I provided a quote, but I had no idea if it was going to appear in press, if my name was even going to appear in press. Because, you can give these interviews to journalists and the journalist will go away and write what they want anyway. I gave a quote, but I had no idea it was actually going to appear in press. And so that was a really nice surprise when it actually did. Because, newspapers, it's a particular form of media. It's not a journal article. It's not an academic book or even a popular history book. So, it was nice to know that they did do the full credit, because, newspapers don't always do that. Even if, the person giving the interview was given the credit, it doesn't necessarily mean the newspaper's going to print it. So that was really, really nice as well.
I listened to your interview with the Tudor chest in preparation for this, and you said this theory on that. Then I looked at the date and it was like July last year. And I remembered that this discovery, as you said, came in 2026. So you did call it. It's out there.
I did. Yeah. Yes, it is out there. So yeah, it's been really nice. And then to see, my name credited in the footnotes of the Capturing a Queen exhibition book from by Owen and Kate. Yeah, it's just it's crazy, but it's a nice kind of crazy.
Absolutely. Well, can you tell our listeners about how they can find you online?
Yes, I'm on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky, and I'm on Tumblr as of yesterday. So I'm Tudor blogger on all of those, or just Tudor blogger on Facebook. I also run a blog and a Substack, again Tudor blogger on both of those. I keep it nice and simple. I'm just Tudor blogger everywhere basically. So yeah, if you want to, my website has lists of all the blogs I've guested on, all the podcasts with links so people can go and check those out. Also has links to where you can buy my book, any of my books. I'm all over it. But yeah, social media, I have taken a bit of a break recently, so don't worry if you don't see all that much from me. I am still around and I will be back.
And could you tell us about your other books?
Yes, my first one was Elizabethan Rebellions, Conspiracy, Intrigue, and Treason, which was published in 2023. As a result of that book, I'll be contributing to Natalie Grueninger's year-long event next year on Elizabethan England. So that's exciting news from that one. My second book was Tudor Executions from Nobility to the Block, which I published in 2024. So that focuses on noble executions under the Tudors and was in fact inspired by the fact that I realised by the end of Elizabeth I's reign, there were no dukes left in England. Not a single one. The last one was executed in 1572 and another one wasn't created until 1623. So England had 50 years without dukes, and I wanted to know how that had happened. Yeah, then The Many Faces of Anne Boleyn, Interpreting Image and Perception, came out in 2025. And then in August 2026, my fourth book, Henry VIII's Quest for an Heir, The King's Great Matter, comes out. And then I'm working on book 5, which will hopefully be out in next year. But we'll see how that goes.
Wonderful. Well, I hope I can have you back for all of those books. Honestly, it really piques my interest. So thank you so much for taking the time to discuss your book and your discoveries.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to the History with Ali podcast. You can find me on Instagram, YouTube, and Spotify at History with Ali. See you next time.